So let's start with a little bit of background on what Git is and why I think it's good for us to learn how to use it. First of all, what is Git? Git is what is called version control software. You can think of it in its simplest form as sort of like Apple Time Machine or other pieces of backup software that freeze the state of your files at certain points in time. The difference here is that you have control over what points it freezes. This allows us to track how the code changes over time. It also lets us go back to older versions if, for instance, either something's broken in a new version and you're not sure what, or if you need to go back to the state the code was in at the time, say you published a paper, to reproduce some of the data from that paper. And I think most importantly for us, it's going to allow multiple people to work together on a code base, merge changes that they make in an efficient manner, but a controlled manner, and we'll talk more about that later. And it will keep track of who made what changes. Now, some of that explains why it's useful. Just to make that clear, one of the reasons that I think Git or other version control software is important for scientists to start using is because it allows changes in code to be tracked, it basically acts as a lab notebook for your code. It lets us reproduce results and account for any errors in the code. It also, like I said, lets you manage multiple versions of the code in such a way that it's a lot easier to switch between them, and it's a lot easier to merge changes between them. So if you have multiple versions right now, you might have it saved in different folders on your computer. What Git allows you to do is merge those folders into a single folder, and then both you can switch between versions within this folder, which saves some cluttering up of your hard drive, and also lets you manipulate these different versions and transfer changes between them really easily. And then the ability to collaborate is, in my opinion, much more efficient than either emailing code to each other or, say, having a shared Dropbox folder. The problem with the shared Dropbox folder is that you have no control over when the changes are pushed. As soon as one person makes a change, everyone has that change, even if they're not ready for it. Git lets you control when changes that other people make are pulled into your code. And similar to the ability to merge changes between different versions locally, it gives you better control over how you integrate changes than if, say, you email code to each other and try and copy and paste the changes, because it knows where the changes are, and it has tools that will automatically overwrite the correct, most recent changes. So as for how Git works, let's start from the top and work down. Git is based on the idea of repositories. Essentially, a repository is a folder which contains all the files you want to track. Now, on your machine, you will have local repositories that only you have access to. These are what allow you to track changes for code within those repositories, and you can have more than one. But if someone else has a repository, there's no direct link. It's not like, again, it's not like a shared Dropbox folder where you directly access someone else's code, or you all directly access the same code. Instead, if we're going to share code, it has to go through a remote repository. And this is how you can control when changes come into your code, because what will happen is someone else will push changes to the remote repository, but until you go ahead and pull those changes, your code will continue to work the same way it always has. Right, so we're talking about repositories, which is often shortened to a repo. What's in those repositories? So as I said, a repository is basically a folder that Git has identified as a repository. It's nothing more complicated than that. The fundamental time step of Git is called a commit. These are basically points in time where you tell Git, hey, this is an important version of the code, this is a stable version of the code. Remember how the code looked at this time. And as you make changes, you'll build up a history of commits that make up the repository. So your code will look like it does in the most recent commit, but the changes are kept track of over all of these different commits. To manage different versions, you use what's called branching. Basically, a branch is another set of commits that runs parallel to your main set of commits. And it allows you to, say, do development work in the blue branch here, but if you need to, you can switch back to the stable green branch, use it for a while, then switch back to the blue branch. Now, this may sound more complicated than keeping two different versions in two different folders, but where this is a lot easier is when you go to bring changes from the blue branch back into the green branch. Because Git is keeping track of how the two branches have diverged since they split from each other, it knows how to bring those changes back together. The last concept to point out is the concept of a head. This is basically just a pointer that tells Git what the repository should look like, which commit the repository should look like. So since this is a pointer, it can be moved around either to previous commits if we wanted to look at an older version of the code, or to other branches. That's how we switch between branches as we move the head. Your workflow will go something like this. Once you create files, they're not tracked by default. In order to get them tracked, you have to explicitly tell Git to add these files. Now once you add them, they're in what's called the stage. It can also be referred to as the index or the cache. I will refer to them as staged files. And these are basically files that are ready to be committed. Either you're ready to make the initial commit, or you're satisfied with the changes that you've made. In either case, once you're satisfied with all the changes, you go ahead and make a commit manually. And this is an important point, is that you tell Git when to make commits. It's not like an automatic backup software where it will make them periodically. You tell it when the code is in a state that you want to save. After you make a commit, as you continue editing the code, the changes that you make go into what's called the working directory. This is basically the state of the files that have changed since the last commit. And as you make changes, the files will look exactly like they do in the working directory. Basically, this working directory is the state your files are in. As you make those changes, again, once you're satisfied with the changes, you stage files, putting them back into the ready to be committed stage. And then you commit, and this cycle repeats. One important point about Git is that it doesn't work by keeping multiple copies of the files in hidden folders or anything. It works by remembering differences, which means there's only ever one copy of the files on your hard drive. And if you go back to an older commit or to a different branch, it modifies files by undoing or replaying changes that it remembers. So for instance, if you start off with the initial commit and then add a line to file 1 and make a new commit, then that middle stage is not a new copy of file 1 and file 2 and file 3. What it is Git remembers from the base versions to the second versions, you added line 2 to file 1. File 2 and 3 haven't changed, so it knows that if it's in that middle version, it needs to add that line. Then if you change the line in file 2 and remove the line in file 3, it remembers those changes, but it's not saving 3 different versions of 3 files. It's saving the changes that you've made. And this both cuts down on the amount of hard drive space it requires and lets it move between different versions much more easily. The downside to this is that a repository is managed by the .git folder. It's a hidden folder in the top level of the repository. And if you delete that folder, all the information on those differences is gone, which means that there's no way to go back and extract an older version. You will only have the version of the files that was in existence at the time you deleted the .git folder. In other words, don't delete the .git folder unless you know exactly what you're doing. So we're going to break up actually using Git into 3 big parts. The first will focus on basic local repository management, so adding and tracking files, how to look at how the file is changed, and how to ignore files that we don't want to track. Then we'll look at how to use branches and how to merge them back together, both creating and merging branches, and we'll talk about 2 different types of merges and what happens when there are conflicts, and how to check out our old versions of files. And only then will we get into using remote repositories. How to set up a remote repository, how to clone from a remote repository, and how to push or pull from a remote repository.